Mazie and the Mysterious Hedge, A Lesson in Forgiveness by Brandi Roper. Illustrations by Kristen Poulsen. Mazie the mouse stood to stretch her back after pruning her roses. She smiled as she admired her handiwork. She kept a beautifully manicured lawn. Not a speck of crabgrass, not a sprig of weeds could be seen. Yes, Mazie took pride in her yard. She was a professional gardener, and she made sure everyone knew it. One fine sunny day, Mazie's friend George stopped by her cottage to visit. George, the handsome gopher, brought his new golf club. He wasn't a pro golfer, but he had high hopes of becoming one. George showed Mazie how the golf club should be held. He demonstrated the new swing he had learned at his golf lesson. George swung the club and accidentally hit the perfectly manicured lawn. "Oh no," George thought. When he looked up, he saw a piece of the ground flying through the air. The horrified look on Mazie's face startled him. He tried to patch the divot. "Mazie, I am so very sorry," George cried. He repeated it as his apology 100 times, but Mazie only said, "Okay." He didn't stay for tea. He didn't stay to chat. He left with his club hung over his shoulder and his head down. Mazie stewed over the clump of turf in her backyard. How could George be so careless? She patched the hole and arranged her outdoor furniture so nobody would see it. To Mazie's surprise, the next morning, a little bitty plant began to trim the border of her entire yard. She investigated to see if it was a weed. To her delight, she found that it was a rare hedge. She giggled with glee, excited to see such beauty. It looked like a picture frame around her pretty lawn. Mazie's friend Sue dropped by unannounced one late afternoon. Now, Sue the mole was a wonderful friend, but she was also not graceful, and she couldn't see well. Mazie led Sue to the back patio. They chatted, enjoyed the sunset. "The new border around your land is adorable," Sue commented. "Why, thank you, Sue. I do love the new addition to my garden," Mazie said, pleased that Sue did not notice the ugly hole George had left by being so clumsy. As the sun sank behind the trees, Sue remembered she needed to make a call. "Oh my, I must get home," she exclaimed as she jumped from her seat. When she scampered off, she knocked over a treasured lawn ornament. The green glass ball resting on a white porcelain pedestal was Mazie's favorite. It was the kind her grandmother had in her garden when Mazie was a child. Sue hurried away as Mazie watched the glossy decoration crash to the ground and shatter into pieces. She squealed in disgust and stomped to the potting shed to retrieve a broom and dustpan. Mazie swept up the pieces. She could not believe that Sue didn't even notice she had tipped the pedestal and ball over. Hadn't she heard the crashing? Of course she had. How could she have missed it? Sue was insensitive and uncaring. No real friend of Mazie's would make such a foolish mistake. She scurried to bed, hurt and angry. First George and now Sue. Mazie needed to be more careful about whom she chose as friends. Mazie awoke to find that the green and lush hedge had grown taller than her gardening pail. As she stepped outside to water the hedge in the backyard, she remembered how Sue had rushed off yesterday to leave Mazie with such a mess to clean. She also spotted the hole George had made. She sighed. She secretly hoped they wouldn't return. Mazie wound up the hose, surprised to see the hedge had grown at least a foot. It had thickened, too. Her green thumb must be to blame. She had a knack for growing plants. As she entered her home, she heard a knock on the front door. Mazie was usually excited to have company, but not today. She cringed to think it might be one of those careless friends. She smiled when she spotted Ruth the rabbit and her small boys waiting patiently on the front porch. Ruth encouraged her boys to play catch. "Be careful not to trample any of the beautiful flowers or the hedge," she told them. The lush hedge had grown to at least the height of a bear's waist. Mazie beamed to hear her friend acknowledge Mazie's efforts with her yard. After being seated in the living room, Ruth asked Mazie about the unusual plant. She also said that it had been quite a chore getting the boys and herself to the door. She explained that they had looked for an entrance or a gate, but had finally resolved that they would indeed have to climb over the hedge, for there was no way through. Mazie hadn't noticed that the hedge allowed no access to the sidewalk or driveway. The idea of the hedge being damaged by Ruth and her boys preoccupied Mazie. Ruth did not seem to notice Mazie's distraction. She rambled on and on about her children and all their latest shenanigans. The boys received the highest marks on their last report card. They must be the smartest bunnies in their grade. Robert says that Jimmy and Jason take after his family, but I know that I had good grades as a child too. Jenny will head off to college before we know it. I can't believe how fast they grow up. Just last week, Joseph was... That was when Mazie heard it, the crashing sound of her prized rose bush, and the lovely trellis that held it sturdy as it stretched toward the sky. Ruth heard only the cry of her youngest, Jimmy, as he lay tangled in the thorns and broken pieces of wood. Jason, Ruth's oldest son, apologized as Mazie and his mother dashed out the front door. He explained how he had thrown the ball too high and Jimmy had jumped to catch it. Mazie's eyes shot fire. As Ruth tried to comfort her son and examine his sores, Mazie ran around the broken mess. "My roses! My trellis! Look at the mess you have made!" Mazie wailed with tears streaming down her cheeks. She showed no concern for the hurt child. She did not see the scrapes and the cuts on the child's arms and face. Ruth scooped up her injured child and ushered Jason out of Mazie's yard. Mazie did not say goodbye or offer to help the mother. She fell to her knees next to the rubble of her prized roses. She sobbed in anger over the mishap of the last few days. Her friends were unfeeling and destructive. Mazie went to bed without eating the sunflower seeds and corn she had prepared herself for dinner. She was too hurt to even consider food. She was tired of being disrespected. She was tired of her efforts not being appreciated. She was tired of cleaning up after her friends. As the new day dawned, Mazie carefully prepared her kit for gardening. She would pull weeds, prune, and of course repair the recent damage. When she opened the front door, Mazie gasped. The mysterious hedge had grown as tall as the roof of her porch. Mazie thought it odd that a hedge would grow that fast. She did not recognize the species of plant, and she could not recall ever seeing one like it. Mazie knelt in front of her flower garden that bordered the front porch. She pulled each weed and snipped each dead leaf. The garden looked nice and neat. Mazie heard a small voice calling to her from the other side of the hedge. "Miss Mazie! Miss Mazie!" the voice squeaked out. "Miss Mazie, I have your paper!" Mazie walked toward the voice just as a rolled-up newspaper flew over the hedge and landed in her freshly groomed flower garden. Dirt scattered up around it. A row of daisies lay crushed underneath the tightly wrapped bundle. Mazie sprinted to save the poor plants, but she was too late. The stems had snapped and could not be recovered. Why? Why? Why do these things happen? She took such care. She made such efforts, and for what? Mazie stuffed her tools into her caddy and trudged into the house. An afternoon rainstorm made it impossible to return to her gardening after lunch. She sat staring out into her yard, pouting. George had torn a hole in her yard. Sue had destroyed her finest lawn decoration. Ruth's rambunctious sons had smashed her roses. Her paper boy had crushed her poor daisies. Mazie could not forgive them for being so careless. Each awful thing had made her feel helpless. Mazie decided to not allow cruel beings into her yard. As a matter of fact, Mazie would not allow terrible creatures in her life. She would keep to herself. She would not answer phone calls or invite others to her home. She couldn't risk being hurt like this again. Mazie watered her garden, tended her flowers, and trimmed the mysterious hedge every day. She found being alone a comfort. She was pleased that her plants grew so well. Her lawn and gardens were the finest anyone had ever seen. The hedge had become a bit overwhelming, though. It was lush and green, but it cast long and dark shadows. Mazie missed the cool afternoon breezes and the hum of the neighborhood. She also missed the compliments and watching cars slow down to admire her work. It had come to her attention that the huge hedge blocked everyone's view in and her view out. She must remedy this, or nobody would be able to appreciate the beauty of her yard. Nobody but her, that was. What was the purpose of working so hard without anyone to notice? It occurred to Mazie that this hedge might not be a frame to highlight her handiwork, but a wall to hide her heart. One evening, as Mazie sat sipping mint tea on her back patio, she heard a car pull up to the end of her driveway. The moment she heard the voice of her former friend, George, Mazie scowled and turned to march back into the house. She screeched to a stop when she saw the hedge grow right before her eyes. Could it be? Did Mazie's anger cause the hedge to grow? "Mazie?" George called out again. He mumbled to himself about her not being home. At that moment, Mazie walked to the hedge in the direction of the driveway. "Is that you, George?" In a voice that sounded relieved, George replied, "Yes, Mazie, it's me, George. Are you okay? I haven't seen you in a while. I want you to know how sorry I am for putting that hole in your yard. I know how much your lawn means to you. I really didn't mean for that to happen. Can you forgive me?" "Forgive you? That club left a crater in my backyard." She was tempted to tell George exactly what she thought. The hedge rustled above her head. She looked up. The hedge was not as pretty as it had been. It looked almost threatening. It seemed to respond to her frustration. She did not wish to encourage its growth. She could tell how sorry George was. He sounded sincere. Maybe he really hadn't meant to hurt her yard. Maybe it was an accident. "George, I forgive you," Mazie said, hoping her voice carried far enough. A strange thing happened when Mazie replied to George. The hedge recoiled. It shrank at least 6 inches. Could it be? Did the forgiveness cause the hedge to change, she thought? Mazie wanted to invite George in for some tea, but she heard him walking away, whistling. "Thank you, George," Mazie shouted. "Thank you for understanding how important my yard work is to me." "You are welcome," George cheerfully said. "Bye, Mazie. Have a wonderful evening." Later that day, a package arrived. The kind delivery man opened the box for Mazie and described exactly what was in it, since he was unable to pass the box through the hedge. He said it was against policy, but he could see that Mazie would not be able to retrieve the package anytime soon. He read the note on the package in a loud, clear voice. "Dear Mazie, I am so sorry that I knocked over your favorite lawn ornament. I knew I heard something crash, but didn't know for sure if I caused the accident. I should have stayed to help you clean up, but I was so very late getting home. I did not want to miss my weekly call to my dear old granny. I hope you will understand. I hope this new lawn ornament will be able to replace your old one. I know how much you loved it. I looked for weeks before I found the perfect one. I couldn't remember what color you had, so I chose the color I thought to be your favorite. Please forgive me and accept this token of my friendship. Yours truly, Sue." The delivery man described the lawn ornament to Mazie. She teared up as she thought of the trouble that her sweet friend had gone through. That gift had cost a bundle, and delivery was not cheap. How thoughtful. Mazie was no longer angry with Sue. Forgiveness replaced her hurt. Immediately, the hedge shrank enough for Mazie to peek over the top of as the truck pulled away. She could see the beautiful ornament shining in the sun. She could hardly wait to place it in her garden. Then she remembered Ruth and her boys. Mazie raced into the house to find Ruth's phone number. She could hardly dial fast enough. Ruth picked up on the second ring. "How is Jimmy?" Did the cuts on his arms and face heal up yet? Was Jason okay? I never considered that I may have hurt his feelings when I was upset, Mazie exclaimed. The boys are recovering nicely. Thank you for asking, Ruth replied. Mazie wanted the boys to know she had forgiven them. She assured Ruth she had easily repaired the damage to the trellis and that new roses were already budding on the plant. She asked Ruth to forgive her for being insensitive about poor Jimmy and his injuries. Ruth sighed and told Mazie that she had forgiven and forgotten weeks ago. She knew how important those roses were, but her boys did not intend to hurt anything, and it was simply an accident. They talked for at least a half an hour. Ruth told Mazie about Jason winning his last ball game and how little Jimmy made excellent grades on his schoolwork. Mazie enjoyed their chat. She had missed her friends dearly. The next day, a thud alarmed Mazie. She swung open her door just as the paperboy rode away. He smiled and waved. Hello, Miss Mazie. It sure is a lot easier to hit your porch now that I can see it. Glad to see that hedge is gone. Mazie smiled. She was glad that hedge was gone too. The mysterious hedge was simply a grudge that disappeared when she forgave her friends. She did not want to be a prisoner of her own anger again. She tiptoed around the yard, making sure every last bit of that pesky hedge was gone for good. It had seemed pretty the first day it appeared. But that is not a plant I want growing in my garden again, she thought. Her garden had never looked so beautiful. The sunlight danced across the tops of her flowers, and the cool breeze blew gently on their leaves. Mazie stood in her front yard. With a smile and a wave, she greeted each creature that passed by or stopped to admire her flowers. She enjoyed visits with her friends. Mazie decided she would never allow her anger to grow out of control again. Forgiveness had reunited her with those she loved. The beauty that surrounded her was not just flowers and plants, but the kindness of others and the love of true friends.